So hello and welcome to our panel on open source diplomacy. As we are arranging this panel in the light of the EU-India People's Summit, we are very well aware that so far the diplomatic summit has been very closed to the civil society engagement. And as a civil society and members of the public, we have come together to arrange this EU-India People's Summit, within the context of which this panel is taking place. And today I have with me Simone Filippini, who is going to moderate the discussion, Yann Philippin and Fredrik Galtung, who will be the speakers for this panel. So welcome all three of you. Simone, I'll hand the floor to you now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ritumbra. I'm really happy to be here and to have this fireplace conversation on an ever-developing issue. I think it's open source diplomacy, the future of diplomacy and how it's evolving from a purely government-to-government type of work to a much more open situation where lots of stakeholders influence the processes, the discussions and the outcomes. Sometimes not enough the outcomes as yet, but let's see where we end up. And I'm so happy to have Fredrik Galtung here with me, who was formerly very much engaged with Transparency International, has then started his own group, which is TrueFootprint, and has over 25 years of experience in working on practical solutions for building integrity and trust and curbing corruption. And Fredrik, on your website, it's being said that Galtung is redefining anti-corruption work from top-down finger-pointing to bottom-up promotion of integrity at the community level. And of course, that also has an impact on the way mutual influencing between governments and citizens works. And then, of course, we have Yann Philippin, whose name sounds a little bit like mine, but my roots are Italian. I don't know about your roots, Yann.
Belgium. You know, Belgium. It's an old Belgian name. One of my ancestors was from Belgium.
Ah, okay. Well, my roots are Italian. You won't see it, but the DNA is still there and the temperamento as well. And you're an investigative journalist. You recently, and I think you're still working on it, did in-depth research on a fighter jet deal between India and France, and you rooted up quite some corruption issues around that deal, and maybe you can say something about that later in this conversation. Also, how you look at that in relationship to open source diplomacy, what the impact could be of bottom-up investigative journalism or research and diplomatic relations between countries and also blocks of countries like the EU versus India and India. So maybe just as a little bit as a starter, that we all know that diplomacy is on the move. I started as a diplomat 30 years ago, and then it was we were all a little bit timid as diplomats, government to government, closed in kind of. You were not supposed to be too much out in the open, etc. I always had some problems with this concept, and I think I was one of the first in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs having social media accounts. I put them under my own name because I knew that I would be basically they would limit my outreach if it would be under the government's name. So I always kept it under my own name, also as an ambassador in North Macedonia. And so we're really seeing a transformation of diplomacy. I have to think of the book, 3 books thinking of diplomacy at this moment. That is, I don't know whether you know the book from Nick Gowing and Chris Langdon, Thinking the Unthinkable. It's about leadership in current times, and they have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of leaders, mostly from the corporate sector, but not just from the corporate sector, and they just often don't know what to do. they are stuck in their own circle, in their own bubble, and they don't know what to do, but they don't dare to ask. So they close off, they become defensive, and you see that that is not constructive. Another book that I have to think of is The Wisdom of Crowds, James Surowiecki. I don't know, probably Fredrik, I see you nodding, you know it. It's about the wisdom that large crowds have over a few people defining the odds. And it's they come in that, he comes in this book with very, very insightful examples of how large crowds know better than very small groups of people. And then the last one I want to mention is the book Leaderless Revolution from Carney Ross, who started an institute which is called the Independent Diplomat in Brussels. And he describes a situation in which basically what you also saw happening in the Arab Spring, that people define the odds, that they organize themselves outside of government circles in a very horizontal, leaderless way. There are no clearly defined leaders. And I think if you look at these issues, they're all related to open source diplomacy issue that we want to discuss today. So are we going to make use of the wisdom of the crowd, and in how far are we going to? What is open source diplomacy? What are the most striking characteristics, and what is needed to get there if we want it? What would need to change in formal diplomatic relations, or for example also in multilateral organizations like the UN, to get more into a situation where others have influence instead of just governments? So could you, Fredrik, start off a little bit on these questions and give us your insights on the issue? What is open source diplomacy for you? Does it make sense? Not just government to government, but involving others.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you for taking on the task of facilitating us with this. You have a lot to contribute to this discussion. Look, I love the way that the question has been framed. It's not that I have thought about it in those terms, but it makes a lot of sense as we have so many other things that have become open sourced, right? And so open sourcing technology, open sourcing democracy. We find examples of open sourcing intelligence gathering with the organization Bellingcat, for example, able to find things and put them out into the public domain. And some say finding stuff that intelligence agencies were not able to find. Clearly, the EU-India summit, which brings together the two biggest democratic blocs in the world, right? India, the world's largest democracy, and the EU, the world's biggest democratic trading area. Some parts of it a bit less democratic than others, and that also applies, unfortunately, to India. And the miracle of India, if we just pause on that for a moment, is that it is a democratic bloc, a unitary country, which has a population more than twice, 2.2 times roughly the size of the European Union. And it holds together as a unitary democratic country with all its ups and downs, but has done so against all the odds. And so it makes a lot of sense that these two democratic blocs would indeed engage with each other very significantly at this time where democracy is under pressure. In fact, democracy is being curtailed in so many places, and COVID has made a lot of that happen, and certainly, unfortunately, in India as well. And so having a parallel track, yes, governments, of course, have lots of opportunities and frameworks in which they meet. And you mentioned the Arab Spring a moment ago, right, which none of the intelligence agencies and the diplomatic corps predicted, saw coming. But the fact is that the CIA has missed, just to mention one intelligence service, has missed most of the big developments that happened geopolitically since the Second World War. They missed them, partly because they didn't have exactly what you talked about, that contact really with people. Now, it's not about doing the job for them and helping them to do their job. It's about actually what is the agenda that people are interested in. And these are not always the agendas, indeed, of governments. Mm-hmm. And so whether it is about the deepening of democracy, it's about social justice, it's about the environment. Denuclearization used to be a big issue. And the anti-nuclear movement, the peace movement, right, was all about working across borders, right, and setting the groundwork for something that governments were not readily doing themselves, and setting the contours for that. So there's a long history of actually diplomacy, truly, policy making being set by people working with other people. The anti-slavery movement, right, comes to mind from many years ago, and then decolonization. Decolonization, the people-to-people aspect of that was fundamental. It didn't just happen because elites agreed that the time had come for decolonization to happen. And nor was it simply, of course, the internal struggle for liberation was important, but the people-to-people dimension was so important as well. As a little footnote to that, the country, I'm Norwegian, born in Oslo, and so Norway was a colony. We don't always think of it that way, but it was a colony of Denmark for a few centuries, and then of Sweden. And the peaceful, completely non-violent way in which Norway got its independence from Sweden had everything to do with people-to-people diplomacy. And this was not just elites again. It was faith-based groups, it was labor unions meeting with each other and agreeing the time had basically come. Let these Norwegians get on with their stuff and do things on their own, right? Mm-hmm. So people-to-people has a very long tradition. And so there's nothing new about that. But what do we mean when we say open source? And I like the way this is being framed, because it is today partly about the use of technology, enabled as we are now by Zoom, for example, mm-hmm. but it is partly about really engaging also large numbers of people into the process. And I think I'll end my initial remarks with that. So we're using technology and we're able to engage many more people. And there are very important agendas that can be progressed in this form. Let's not be naive. There are less progressive, let us say, agendas that are also being advanced on the people-to-people mm-hmm. dimension, right? Without any intervention of states. So it's incumbent on those who are interested in sustainability, in us having a more sustainable world, and reducing our carbon footprint, advancing an agenda of peaceful coexistence. We cannot just be sitting on our backsides and hoping that states will take care of those interests for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think these are very, very good remarks, especially also that you point out that people-to-people action and people-to-people diplomacy basically has taken place for a long time already. I was thinking also about, the end of decolonization still isn't really totally there.
No.
If we look at movements in the world, but also, for example, the Black Lives Matter, a huge global movement, or what is happening now if we look at climate activism, which you could say, or this is just a progressive agenda, but it's not totally true, because if we look at who are the polluters and who are the ones suffering the effects of pollution, you can see that, in a sense, this is a kind of neo-colonial situation, one might say. So it's always the same who suffer, again, even in modern times. But that is maybe another discussion also a little bit. If we look at the development cooperation, development aid, we could have that another for another fireplace talk. Yann, I see that your video is turned off. Well, you turn it on again. Thank you so much. Could you react on concept of open source diplomacy, what I have said, what Fredrik has said, and what you would like to bring into the discussion?
Yes, diplomacy has always been a secret thing, a secret process behind closed doors between diplomats. And usually at the end of such summits, like the EU-India summit that we are experiencing now, you have basically a few declarations, general declarations that are often not very specific. So it's often difficult for the general public to understand what happened, what is the use of this kind of big diplomatic summits like the G7 or the G20, And so there's a real issue, both for citizens and for the media, as I am a reporter, to try to shed light about what's happening in these summits, why they are important, and if the leaders that discuss behind these closed doors take into account the input of civil society. And it's also a very important task because often diplomacy is not considered as a priority, for ordinary citizens. What they think about is the economy, is jobs, is health, sometimes safety. And so it's more difficult to get people interested in these big summits that can be seen sometimes as as far from their daily life preoccupations and daily life interests. So there's a real importance for the media to promote this, to promote the involvement of civil society in these kind of summits, and to basically make our leaders accountable about what they say there and the agenda and issues that they are pushing.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I agree with you. And you see lots of basically it's really strange that, for example, well, if you have a G20, at least those are elected leaders. But if you look at, for example, World Economic Forum, that is, you could say that's also a diplomatic hotspot, right? But with lots of attendees there who have no democratic legitimacy at all, and it's a closed environment. So in how far, or how do you look at that? These informal gatherings with highly powered, super influential people based just on their basically financial assets, their economic power, and having no democratic legitimacy. So what kind of diplomacy would you call that? How do you look at that kind of diplomacy?
It's a difficult question. I'm not sure we can call it diplomacy. Maybe it's parallel diplomacy, and that's the reason why there's often been counter summits organized in parallel with the Davos summit. What we can say is that these non-elected leaders that gather in Davos, they cannot make decisions because they are not elected. Some of them are government officials, so they can make decisions. But yeah, that's a real problem, and maybe one way to solve it is that more people from civil society, from NGOs, should be invited to these parallel summits. For instance, for Davos, I don't think it's really healthy that that most of the participants basically come from the business environments, because even if they also invite people with different backgrounds, it's important that these people maybe are more challenged, and that they are not only in their comfort zone when they are discussing in these parallel summits.
Yeah. So if I look at this open source diplomacy concept and people, basically people to governments influencing trajectories, we can see very different ones, like during the Arab Spring, or if you look at Black Lives Matter movement that everybody knows, you can see that it's a real people's movement. And yes, they have also a formal influence. If you look at, for example, those large summits in New York at the UN level, basically there are parallel, how you say there are parallel conferences by civil society being organized. I've been at such conferences, but I've been on both sides, in official delegation of the Netherlands, but also in those, as the director, the ED of CORDAID, which is one of the largest humanitarian development organizations in the Netherlands. And then you see that basically it's, these are totally separate trajectories, the formal negotiations taking part, and then these people's summits, which have no formal influence. And like the UN has, is just a state to state in the end, government to government forum, because there's no democratic democratic part to it. There's no parliament in the UN. So civil society has difficulties reaching the decision makers. So how could we improve that? If you look at open source diplomacy, in order for it not to remain kind of an empty shell?
This is a long struggle, right, Simone? And we could give many examples, but let me give one that is really from the present and what we're going through, all of us, which is the COVID pandemic. And so, you know, the COVID pandemic has been dealt with almost exclusively from a supply side, providing personal protective equipment, COVID testing, and then vaccination and money, etc. And now, of course, the crisis of the oxygen tanks and these technical terms that we didn't know about only a few weeks ago, about condensers, etc. The demand side around the COVID pandemic got almost no funding. Really none to speak of at all. The demand side is patients, healthcare workers being able to demand and act on, right? Having protections, having access to these things, working bottom up from high-risk communities, etc. Now, there's nothing new about this. This is how the AIDS pandemic has been dealt with relatively successfully, is always through this people-centered approach. But what we have taken in the COVID pandemic is a government-centered, multilateral-centered, with virtually no people-centered approach to speak of. There are a few exceptions. And unfortunately, in India, you know, the horrendous state of affairs is partly an expression of this. Civil society was muzzled. They could not complain. They could not alert. They could not criticize. They could provide meals to people, but they were not allowed to criticize, not allowed to be critical, and no money to speak of at all was devoted to a people-centered approach. So it's not that it's a moral imperative simply. It's not nice to have. It's catastrophic in its consequences if you don't do it. It simply does not work. In tiny countries, you can get certain things done. But even in Taiwan, which has done such an extraordinary job, and of course authoritarian countries can do certain things, but Taiwan was with a full engagement of civil society, open sourcing so many solutions, right? So it's catastrophic in its consequences for not doing it. It's not a shame, it's not a pity, it's not a moral imperative, it's really horrendous. And as I said, all of these things that were missed, including the Arab Spring, right, by not being in touch with people, not being able to take the temperature of change. But ultimately, the Arab Spring, of course, failed overwhelmingly, right? There was one little light, maybe a light and a half in Tunisia and Morocco. The rest is worse in many ways than it was before 2011.
That's not really a surprise, by the way, right?
Well, the counterforces were phenomenally large, right? The UAE alone providing, right, over 10 billion, or was it 100 billion? I can't remember, but the sums were so big, right, just to Egypt alone, to make sure that the Morsi regime would fail and fall. So, yes, the countervailing forces were very, very significant. But, so obviously not every people's movement succeeds, right? But again, if that groundwork isn't there, significant lasting change, and I can give you the examples right from the world of sustainability. If we just take conservation for a second, right? There isn't a single case in the world where conservation works where it's to the detriment of the people living in the area. It's never happened. You can have the strictest laws, the highest protections. It will not work if people are not part of the equation.
Yeah, that's the positive formulation, that you have to make people part of the equation to get the right results. And I think if you look, for example, at the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Agenda 2030, where no one should be left behind, that is the ultimate goal. You see that governments cannot do the job alone, never ever.
Indeed.
So they need to involve local communities, influencers, civil society. And of course they don't to an adequate level. And that's part of the reason why that agenda lags hopelessly behind the goals that should have been already achieved after 5 years, right? It's now nearly 6 years, by the way. So you're totally right. It's that's very important, and it doesn't happen. So is it all about control? What do you think, Yann? Is this all about control? Like I was thinking also a little bit about your issue on arms deals. Basically, yeah, what you were investigating is about arms deals, and we all know that there are trillions of dollars every year going to expenditure on arms, partly secret, partly little bit open, but mostly secret. And of course, there are many more secret deals that we don't even know about, probably, because a huge amount of money involved. And it goes to the detriment of normal people, because those arms are being used by authoritarian regimes, etc. So how do you look at that?
Yes, arms deals are maybe the most opaque sector of diplomacy, because if you take this example of the sale of 36 fighter jets by France to India, this is a government-to-government contract. So that's not, that's not a simple contract between the government of India and a supplier. This is negotiated at the highest level of the state and of political power. And unfortunately, the information given to the public is very scarce. You just have the overall amount of the deal. You don't have the details. You don't have the way these weapons can be used or not. You don't know if there are restrictions of use of these weapons that has been decided by the country who sells them. And of course, you don't know what's the behind the scenes. And as we seen with the Rafale, but also with many other deals, there are very often suspicions of corruptions between these, in these deals. And so it is really crucial that there is more transparency on these deals, but unfortunately there is not. And years pass, and there's been many scandals around arms deals, and the transparency has not improved. So it's a very important issue. First, because as you said, these weapons are used, and also because they are very costly. For the Rafale, we talk about nearly 8 billion euros, which is a huge sum for a country like India. And of course, every country needs to defend itself. So I don't say that we should abandon every arms spending. But
that would be great. Seriously, that would be fantastic,
but,
right? That should be the ultimate goal, and let's put that money into building peaceful societies in a peaceful world.
In an ideal world, there would be no arms. But there's a real issue about this amount of money. That is it worth spending so much money in arms, especially today, with the pandemic, where there are huge needs. First for the health system, as we see in the crisis in India, and also because this pandemic has very profound implications and dramatic implications for economy, for the jobs, for poverty.
Yeah.
And so there is really this debate about that. For instance, there is this 8 billion euro contract by the Rafale, there is something that they call the Indian specific improvements, meaning that the Indian government asked to Dassault, who is the manufacturer of the Rafale, to improve the plane for specific needs of the Indian army. And I don't remember the precise figure, but I'm quite sure that these improvements were built more than 1 billion euros. So, and that's something that was not really discussed, I mean, with the public, during the negotiations. Is that, okay, we are Indian, we need fighter planes, we buy them, but really, do we really need to spend billions or hundreds of millions of euros just to improve a plane that works perfectly well in the French army, So that's this kind of opaque issues behind these diplomatic arms deals that, of course, should be more open and should be more widely discussed with civil society.
Do you, so going into this, because I look at you and I see an investigative journalist and I see somebody working on transparency and development cooperation issues and sustainability. So these two basically are totally in controversy. I mean, all these weapon deals throughout the world, that's for which countries spend huge amounts of money, are in direct competition with for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind, building peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable socio-economic and ecological society. So why is there no more outrage in public outrage? Also a question to you, Fredrik. There's basically no serious, effective, sustained, visible, citizens-based or civil society-based campaign against the huge amounts of money worldwide being spent on military power. I see, of course, all kinds of smaller campaigning, but I don't see, like on the climate, or some others, that you really get people coming together and getting some real effect and power.
I must say that on these deals, I think that the improvements should come from the sellers, meaning, for instance, the selling countries, I mean, and in this specific case from France, because I've been really shocked by the huge difference there's been in the coverage of our investigation about the suspicions of corruptions on this deal in France and in India. In India, there's been a huge coverage. The media talked a lot about it, and in France there's been almost nothing. And you can understand it, because India is a buying country, so there's a lot of money, so it interests people, why did we spend these 8 billions, and has there been corruptions behind this deal? But in France, my feeling is that there's some kind of realpolitik or cynicism that says, basically, we sold these planes, that's a huge amount of money that is coming to France, so 8 billion. And, whatever, we need to keep our technology, we need to keep our jobs, the people that work in the factories building the Rafale. And there's always this kind of speech saying, if we don't do it, the Americans will do it, or the British will do it, or the Chinese will do it. And so when you try to question these arms deals, there's always this dominant argument saying, okay, don't bother us with all the problems, with corruption, with human rights, with how these weapons could be used. The most important is our job and our technology, and the fact that basically, if we don't do it, others will do it. And so it's difficult for civil society in the selling countries, to push these agendas, because they are widely perceived as anti-French. That basically that selling less arms would be against our direct economic and technological interests. So that so there's been some moments, for instance, about the weapons sold to the belligerents in the Yemeni war, you know, which is the humanitarian catastrophe. So there's been some countries who restricted the trade of weapons involved in this war, but of course, basically we could do more so that this becomes an issue more of an issue in the countries that sell these weapons.
Yeah, because it's also really strange that, of course, we have EU principles on human rights, very strong principles, human rights and European values. For example, we have the human rights agreements in the UN context. We have human rights court of justice. We have, but basically we export relentlessly, and there are a few countries in Europe that do that. It's the UK especially, it's France, Germany. Germany now suspended, by the way, its arms exports to India because of the human rights record. But for me, it's surprising that there's not much more public outrage on this issue, and no organized campaigning, and not even really in the European Parliament. So how do you look at those important issues that prevent a more peaceful world, basically, and boost militarism in some countries that buy these weapons?
Simone, I think you're asking such a good and important question. I would love to hear your answer to it as well. But yeah. I would suggest, you know, so Yann, I agree with you. I think there is a bit of nationalism involved. I think some NGOs have simply become a bit too dependent on government funding. So they don't necessarily want to be loud about that. And so these are the large, you know, development NGOs, most of whose funding, or a very significant portion of which, comes from public sources. But there is another issue I would suggest. So, you know, there are the small campaigning organization, Campaign Against the Arms Trade and others, and then there are certain politicians who will make their voices heard, but you're right, Simone, it's not very loud. But here's where I would like to be a bit self-critical about it. Mm-hmm. Because what's the alternative? The alternative surely is development, right? Is providing the support resources to make sure that indeed these societies are stable, that people are lifted out of poverty, that they're not so miserable and so corrupt, that the only thing they can do is to become refugees, for example, or, you know, have a fragile state that's easily taken over by some extremist, religious fundamentalist, etc. Mm-hmm. And there, let's be self-critical about it, Simone, is, you know, how many billions have not been invested and shown that they were able to demonstrate, you know, really produce the goods. Mm-hmm. After, you know, the trillions that the US has spent, and of course it wasn't spent on development in Afghanistan and Iraq, but nonetheless hundreds of billions were. And what do they have to show for it? So is it a problem of the Afghans? Is it a problem of the way aid works? It's not, you know, obviously it can't just be blamed on the local population by any means. But the fact is that there isn't such a straightforward, viable alternative to make the world more peaceful mm-hmm. by non-violent means. And this is where there is a failure of the sector, right? How do we make the world more peaceful by non-violent means? And there, you know, whether there are progressives who should be more self-critical about this and who should be asking much tougher questions about indeed what is that viable alternative.
Yeah. Yes, these are very good questions, and of course they are very important ones as well. What I see is that basically, if you look at the present-day development cooperation, that it's sustaining I tend to start using the word neo-colonial more and more. Okay. Because basically it is still the country that gives aid and the one that receives it, and is in the grip of dependence. And it's a very unhealthy situation. And people, and lots of that money, as you just referred to, disappears in the pockets of corrupt leadership in countries, or incompetent leadership, or disappears somewhere along the way. You know, it filters away, but it doesn't end up with the people who really need it. And also what you see is that development money so far hasn't really contributed to building in the countries concerned the enabling environment for sustainable peace, for inclusive and sustainable socio-economic development. So that is the role of a state, of a government, and that is to see to it that an enabling environment is built for people to flourish. People are very well able to take care of themselves if they have the opportunities. But you see everywhere in the world where things are going into the wrong direction, people are being suppressed, governments are underperforming, there's no proper enabling environment for people, rules and regulations suck, corruption is rampant, infrastructure is not properly being developed. Look at a country like DRC Congo. How many billions have gone into Congo? There are not even proper roads for people to move on. You know, there's no road from the west to the east. There's a horrific situation going on with extraction industry robbing the country empty. You know, so and those are sometimes Western companies who, in their own country, have to apply the rules of engagement, but in being abroad they don't. And there's no public outrage because people in many of those countries are being suppressed. They are dependent in terms of information flows on relatively limited information, have no or hardly any access to internet, many of them. So it's really difficult to get your hands to it. But what I think is that it's this old motto that we in develop, if you think of development cooperation, but also, you know, all the engagements as to human rights, peace building, etc., that we still produce the fish, but not give people the tools to learn to fish. And I think that really needs to stop. And you see, of course, everywhere in the world, very encouraging and inspirational examples of bottom-up innovations and developments, but governments, many governments, both local, regional, and national, and the international community. Look at what's happening in the UN, these annual circuses of leaders speaking as if their country is doing perfectly well. But I always take the rankings and I Google the rankings while listening to them, and then you see what the realities are, right? So we really need to think about the bloody basics that are not being met at this moment. And hold leadership much more accountable, harder accountable. You know, what I see, for example, I served as the Dutch ambassador to Macedonia, which is now North Macedonia, right? And then there was this name issue between Greece and Macedonia, North Macedonia. And then you see that the European Union's problem is to hold countries accountable, to hold their members accountable to their actions. And everybody goes along. So you see government to government politeness, fear to address issues, fear to hold others accountable to our own principles are really problematic. So it's up to citizens all of a sudden to try to do this. And it provides huge frustrations among many populations. Aggression, people to people aggression, people frustrated, people starting to hate one another, being also guided by their governments to do so. So I think, I always think that in international relations, accountability is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And if you look at open source diplomacy, I think that people So the wisdom of the crowd is there, and that could, it is able to hold governments accountable, like you do, Yann. It's holding governments accountable for their behavior, and the pressure should rise. So how do we let the pressure rise? How do we see to it that accountability, if you agree with me that accountability is really, really important issue, how do we see to it that open source diplomacy contributes to more accountability of governments to produce results for the common good and not for themselves? Or like one of you said, I think you said that, Fredrik, that the agenda of governments is sometimes very difficult from the agenda of people. And I agree with that. They have their own agendas. I hear a stunned silence. Sorry.
Yann, do you want to go first?
It's a difficult question because I'm a reporter, so yeah. I cannot act more than basically disclosing facts, and maybe what's important is that the media try to give more space to what civil society says. There's been a striking, it's not about India, but there's been a striking example just 2 days ago, because there's been an exclusive from a journalistic NGO that France sold more Rafale to Egypt. As you know, Egypt is a country with an awful track record in terms of human rights. Mm-hmm. What happened is that many media just covered this information on the angle of a great success for France at exporting things.
Wow.
And so there's been some articles stressing that maybe it could be a problem to sell fighter planes to such a regime as we have today in Egypt. But that was not the majority of the way the information has been covered. And so the two only options there is that civil society puts more pressure on this issue, and also that the media try to have a balanced coverage. And of course, they can stress that this is a success for French industrial, for French arms manufacturers. But they shouldn't forget to mention that there are, of course, problems with the fact of selling weapons to authoritarian regimes. But as reporters, we cannot act ourselves. We can only reflect what happens. And so, if there is not more involvement of civil society, we cannot do more than basically talking about what's happening. Mm-hmm. So there must be voices. If we want to, we cannot cover this if there are no voices emerging.
Yeah.
I certainly see where you're coming from, Yann, and I think this is, of course, this is in your job description and what you do. But I would add to accountability. So I think accountability is really important, but it cannot stop with that. That I would say that part of the purpose of open source diplomacy, or a people-to-people approach, is to have a vision first for an alternative, and then to actually create and lay the groundwork for an alternative path. That simply to call out the failure is important, it's extremely important, but it's not sufficient. So to call out and to have evidence of the corruption is, of course, it's vital. It's a breach of the law. Mm-hmm. It's a breach of the responsibility of politicians, of course, and diplomats on both sides. Not simply on the Indian side, right? The giver is as responsible as the taker. But it's just as important to have a vision of an alternative and to lay the groundwork for that. The politicians, do not want to take risks. They are perfectly willing to follow. If they can see that there is an alternative that has a high chance of success, it's not that they're bad people there, right? They're just worried for their careers. They're worried not to make a step in the wrong direction. So this, to me, is the role of open source diplomacy and of a people-to-people gathering. We haven't had a chance to go into depth here on really beyond, of course, the important arms deal, but on what can we learn from each other between these two biggest democratic blocs, both of our warts and our failures, and actually what's really strong, right? How can we benefit from each other? Again, these are the two biggest democratic blocs there are in the world. So surely, if democracy matters to us, we have a lot to gain from this, right? We are not, the EU is the biggest economic area perhaps, but China is doing pretty well for itself and is showing an alternative model, right? An alternative model that has a lot of trust from its own people, as far as we can tell. And so incumbent upon us is to show that there is really an alternative path. And that includes in issues of conflict, of course, includes in issues of development, etc.
Yeah. It's interesting. I now have to think of, in Amsterdam, I visited once, I think I just started as ambassador. I started a place where there was an open source thing of a building, beautiful old middle-aged building, where there were experiments on open source product development. And one of them was soup. So there was a simple recipe of soup that was being produced in Amsterdam, and then it was distributed all over the world. And everybody who wanted to come on board produced exactly according to the recipe, that soup, and then started adding suggestions to improve it. And in the end, this became a fantastic soup with flavors from all over the world in it. So that it, listening to you, Fredrik, I think that would be a fantastic thing that could happen. And by the way, it is happening, of course, in many environments. If you look at many people's movements on women's rights, on human rights, on climate, on many issues that are important to citizens, you see that together, all those people, and I'm part of the kind of the movement, you could say, they are trying to contribute to making the best soup. So this is basically what the leaderless revolution and the wisdom of crowds is all about, right? The only thing is that how to get it to formal channels, that soup, to make it, to have the kitchen chef listen to the people how to make that best soup, right?
Well, I mean, there again, journalism, there is a small movement of peace journalism and solutions journalism, right? And so in a way that is, the prospect of showing something, right, that works and communicating that to a wide audience, beyond lifestyle choices and etc. And obviously, again, the accountability work is so important, but I think there are additional elements that can be brought to bear. I love the metaphor. The soup is obviously a product, but it's a beautiful metaphor as well that you have shared, Simone.
Yeah. So I'm pushed here. If you look in the chat box, you see a question from Anu to Yann. I really need to come back to it because we have another 5 to max 10 minutes left. How do you explain the fact that, unlike in India, the French media didn't seem to have covered the controversy related to Rafale jets with adequate enthusiasm and rigor? I think you already touched on that issue, by the way. Also, how do you compare this with the very old l'affaire Karachi, the sale of French submarines to Pakistan in 1994, and the Bofors India-Sweden armament contract scandal in India? The response of the judiciary in France, India, and the role of journalists in these scandals. What needs to be done so that things improve for future investigations? I think this is really your soup, to be honest. Yes. So eat it, please.
It's difficult to compare with the Karachi case because, in the Karachi case, there's been violence and death at the end, which is not the case yet in this Indian deal. Maybe the last part of the question is it's not about diplomacy, but it's about independence of the judiciary. And in this Rafale case, we can see obviously that there's been a real problem of independence of the judiciary, both in India and in France. Because what we disclosed in our investigation is that both the Indian enforcement agencies and the French enforcement agencies had very precise information about these suspicions of corruptions. You know, we talked about intermediaries, about offshore payments, about very strange things happening behind the scenes, leak of secret documents. So there were a lot of information that were already brought to the authorities by complaints from the civil society, also that were already in other case files that were investigated by these agencies. And basically, these agencies sit on this. And so that's very important that that there is, I would say, more independence of the judiciary. I mean, both in India and France, and it's a shame because we are both great democracies. You know, India is the biggest democracy in the world. France often praise itself for, let's say, not inventing democracy, but, you know, contributing a lot to it in its history. And so in this very sensitive, politically sensitive issue, we would need, you know, a more independent judiciary, and that's also why accountability is important, because you know, since our investigation, there's been a new complaint filed in India. There's also been a new complaint filed in France, and so know that many details are in the open. Maybe the justice will wake up and investigate this case seriously.
Okay, yeah. So maybe just as a little last point, what I would like to ask you, because on the one hand, of course, at this moment you have, say, hyper-empowered individuals and organizations, businesses, religious networks, and other parts of civil society influencing development, circumventing formal organizational structures, influencing developments, trying to promote peace, justice, whatever, could also be negative. I think, Fredrik, you referred to that in your first intervention. On the other hand, and so that's very open. On the other hand, you have, for example, China. And there was in the beginning of internet was the idea that everything would be out in the open and that information would seek all the openings, that it would try to be always out in the open. But in China, they talk about China behind a Chinese wall. So that within China, information is being, you know, it looks like open and internet, but basically it's behind a Chinese wall because it's not open to the outside. So people have difficulties getting information, but many think that this is an open information. How would that influence say open source diplomacy, and how would it influence, you think, the future of information? Do you think this will be more and more the case, like the social, this is the social credit issue in policy in China, more and more technological opportunities for countries to control their citizens, and on the other hand you have the positive sides of technological developments and open sourcing. So it's a little bit of a big question maybe for the last 5 minutes, but how do you look at that? It's kind of controversy.
I think it's enormously challenging, Simone, and in a sense you're laying the groundwork for the next session that we should have, perhaps. But yes. Look, so China is obviously its own particular space, but I think what we I don't think it contradicts, right? These curtailments on social media, which again, unfortunately, have been happening in India in significant ways in the COVID crisis as well. Yeah, they are yet another expression, right, of these challenges and of simply the importance, but it doesn't make it impossible. There have been iron curtains before. So yeah, the effort still remains, and the question remains about what is the nature of those engagements. And actually, if you look at it deeper than the question of simply the internet access and the Great Firewall of China, yeah, what is the quality, right, of people-to-people engagements with people in China, with Russia, for example, right? I think those are indeed very pregnant, important questions. But again, if we can do a better job between India and the EU, maybe that lays some groundwork as well.
Okay, thanks so much. Yann, would you like to speak a few last words? I hope it's not the really last words, but like in this specific session.
Fredrik's answer was very nice. I think it's okay for me.
Thanks so much. Well, from my side, I would, before I give Anu the floor, I would really like to thank you for the discussion. And I think we have to come together again and continue the discussion, and maybe also focus on some aspects of it, because this is quite important, I think, for the future of diplomacy, but also of people-to-people engagement, especially also those last issues that we tabled. Thanks so much for your inputs, and Anu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simone. Thanks to all of you, to Fredrik, Yann, and Simone for this riveting, fascinating discussion. And I think I agree, if EU and India are going to make agreements on different topics and issues which matter to the people of both these goals, it is only natural and normal that we expect access to this discussion, to these debates, And our EU-India summit is one such attempt where we are forging ahead this open source diplomacy. So there are a lot more sessions which are planned until 8th of May, and I request all of you to join and spread the word, and we will take this discussion forward. So stay safe, stay good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Simone.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.